The quietest neighborhoods often hold the darkest secrets. For months, the small village of Hamden in Vinton County, Ohio, went about its business, unaware that just a few blocks away, 16 children were allegedly confined to a single room, living in conditions that investigators would later describe as worse than what they would keep their livestock in. The discovery of these children, ranging in age from 18 months to 18 years, sent shockwaves through the community and across the nation. The question of who to hold responsible became an immediate one, and now new court filings, shocking investigation details, and major developments have emerged in one of the most disturbing true crime cases in recent memory. The grandfather in this case collapsed on his way to a court hearing, ending up hospitalized with a condition serious enough that the county says it can't afford to keep him locked up. And now his own defense attorney is asking a judge to determine whether the man is even mentally fit to stand trial. Meanwhile, the mother of those 16 children is making her own desperate push to get out of jail. On top of all that, a retired detective who led the investigation into the Turpin family, arguably the most infamous child abuse case in modern American history, has weighed in on what's happening in Ohio. And the parallels he's drawing are not reassuring. If you're new here and you appreciate deep dives into cases that demand answers, please take a moment to subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, following the evidence wherever it leads and giving a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Subscribe now and join a community that believes every life deserves to be fully investigated. There's a lot to get through, so let's get into it. If you're just catching up, here's a quick recap. On June 30th, deputies in Vinton County went to a home on Omar Street in the small village of Hamden to serve a warrant on something totally unrelated to child welfare, and instead they found 16 kids, ages 18 months to 18 years old, allegedly confined largely to a single room roughly 12 feet by 12 feet, a space smaller than a standard prison cell built for one inmate. Just paste that out wherever you are right now. 12 steps by 12 steps. That's 144 square feet. Divide it 16 ways and you get 9 square feet per child, smaller than a twin mattress. That's before anyone moves, before anyone sleeps, before anyone tries to exist in a space that was never meant to hold that many human beings. Human waste was found throughout the home, several of the children reportedly unable to speak. One 18-year-old who, according to investigators, could not write her own name. The Ohio Attorney General, Andy Wilson, said the children looked almost like feral animals. The county sheriff said his livestock was kept in better conditions. Wilson also made clear no cages were found in the home, which sounds like a bright spot until you realize the bar has dropped so low that the absence of cages is what passes for good news. 7 of those children were hospitalized. 2 had to be airlifted by medical helicopter to trauma centers in Columbus. 1 was listed in critical condition. And none of it was the result of a phone call for help. No one called 911. No one reported these children missing or in distress. They were discovered the way you discover something that's been sitting there untouched and unseen for a very long time. As far as most of the neighbors knew, these kids didn't exist. One neighbor told the Associated Press he'd never seen a single child at the property. Another said she'd glimpsed some of the children once at a yard sale. Noticed they were dirty, but just assumed they'd been playing outside. She says she's losing sleep over it now. 4 adults were arrested. The mother, the father, and the paternal grandparents, each facing 16 counts of child endangering, a second-degree felony in Ohio, carrying 2 to 12 years per count. All 4 have pleaded not guilty. That's the baseline. Now, here's what's changed since then. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, drop a like below. It helps more people discover these cases and ensures that victims like these children are never forgotten. And if you want to see more investigations like this one, we've linked a few more in the description. Go check them out and subscribe so you never miss an update. The grandfather, Gary Sider Sr., 73 years old, fell during a transport to what was supposed to be a preliminary hearing. He was taken to Ohio Health Obolnis Hospital in Athens, where doctors ran tests and determined he has a serious medical condition, one that requires specialized care at a larger hospital outside the area. Nobody's saying publicly what that condition actually is. His attorney has declined to even name the hospital he was transferred to, citing medical privacy. What we do know is why he's no longer in jail. Because he hasn't been convicted of anything, the cost of his medical care legally falls on the county, not the state. And Vinton County, which is the least populous county in Ohio, a place where the grand jury only meets every other month because there isn't enough caseload to justify anything more, apparently could not absorb that cost. The prosecutor, William Archer, put it plainly, the community isn't at risk because of this bond. This isn't about trusting the man. It's about the fact that his medical care could have potentially bankrupted the county and local taxpayers weren't going to be the ones covering it. So the judge converted his $300,000 cash bond into a $300,000 recognizance bond, which essentially means they're trusting he'll show up. If and when he's released from the hospital, he'll be fitted with a GPS monitor. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, and yeah, the timing of all of it is hard to ignore. A man facing 16 felony counts falls on his way to a hearing, and suddenly he's out of custody. It looks bad. But when you actually sit with what the prosecutor said, the math behind it is straightforward. Even if the optics aren't, he's not convicted. The county pays for his care. The county can't afford his care. That's it. Whether you're comfortable with that outcome or not, the legal logic is what it is. Now, here's where it gets more complicated. Just days after that hospitalization, his attorney, Dorian Baum, filed a motion asking for a full competency evaluation and alongside it, a notice that the defense is considering pursuing a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. And these are two very different legal questions that people online tend to blur together constantly. So, let's actually walk through what each one means. Competency is about right now. Can this man understand the charges against him, understand who the people in the courtroom are and what their roles are, and actually assist his own attorney in his defense? If the answer is no, the entire case effectively freezes. He'd be sent for evaluation, possibly restoration treatment at a mental health facility to see if he can eventually be brought to a place where he understands what's happening. If he can be restored, the case resumes. If he can't be restored, if evaluators determine there's no treatment that will bring him to that baseline, he's simply deemed permanently incompetent, and the court is left figuring out what happens next with a defendant who may never be tried in the traditional sense. The charges don't go away, they just sit there unresolvable. Insanity is a completely separate question, and it only comes into play after competency is settled. It asks whether at the specific moment the alleged offense occurred, the person understood that what they were doing was wrong. It is a legal term of art, not a colloquial "he's crazy" defense, and not something that gets thrown out to avoid consequences on a technicality despite what gets said about it online. You can be found not guilty by reason of insanity because you were hearing voices. You can also be found not guilty by reason of insanity because you had such a severe decompensation of mental faculties, dementia for instance, that you genuinely could not appreciate the wrongfulness of what was happening around you. It's a narrow standard, not a loophole. His attorney described what he personally observed meeting with his client. Significant confusion about the legal process. An inability to describe the roles of the people involved in the case, including his own attorney's role, and an inability to maintain a clear, consistent train of thought. He described a man who could understand a person greeting him, but couldn't engage with any sophistication about what was happening to him legally. He said collateral information appears to confirm his client is dealing with a genuine decline in mental function, though he was careful to say he's not a doctor and isn't diagnosing his own client. What he did say is that in every interaction he's had with the man in person and on video, there have been real physical issues too. Mobility problems, difficulty hearing, what appear to be significant hip issues. And it's his understanding the man may need a wheelchair full-time, not just for one court appearance. He described his client as, in his words, a sad and sympathetic character, not because of what he's charged with, but because of the sheer level of confusion he observed. Asked directly whether he thinks the prosecutor is going to fight this competency motion, the attorney didn't seem worried. In his experience, nobody objects to a good faith competency evaluation because it isn't a defense trick, it's a bedrock legal requirement. You cannot move a criminal case forward, no matter how strong the evidence is, if the defendant doesn't understand what's happening to him. The prosecutor himself seemed to acknowledge that much publicly without objecting. A judge has since ordered both the competency and mental health evaluations to move forward. The results of those evaluations, and what they mean for whether this 73-year-old man ever faces a trial, are still pending. The other three defendants notably have not raised similar questions about their own fitness to stand trial. If this story has you hooked so far, drop a like below. It helps more people discover these cases and ensures that victims like these children are never forgotten. And if you're into more investigations like this one, we've linked a few more in the description. Go check them out and subscribe so you never miss an update. There's also an emotional layer to this that's worth sitting with. A family member, Ronnie Fletcher, married to one of Gary Sr. and Christina Sider's daughters, pushed back publicly on the idea that this was always what the family looked like. He said the grandparents raised 4 other daughters who are, in his words, successful members of society. He said the home used to be clean, functional, ordinary, what he called a normal American home. He described Elizabeth, the mother of the 16 children, as someone who came from a difficult home life as a teenager and essentially escaped into the Siders household, not forced but drawn to it as something better than what she had. There are photos from 2023 that seem to back up at least part of what Fletcher described, the grandparents looking well clean composed. Nothing like what law enforcement described after the arrests, which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question nobody's fully answered yet. If this family was functional once, what changed and when? Investigators have said the family moved around through multiple Ohio counties and even out of state to Wisconsin over the years. And there's reporting that Children's Services in a county near Vinton once visited the family, after which they relocated, which some believe was a deliberate attempt to stay ahead of anyone who might have removed the children. The Attorney General himself said the family was good at hiding these kids. If that's accurate, whatever happened in that house didn't happen overnight. It built for years alongside a pattern of avoiding exactly the kind of oversight that might have caught it sooner. Not every family's statement has landed the same way. One of Elizabeth Sider's own brothers posted publicly attempting to explain or in some ways minimize what happened, leaning heavily on the idea that low intelligence rather than intent was behind it. He pushed back on the more disturbing details reported by law enforcement as untrue, argued the family did the best they could given their limitations, and placed most of the blame on the man of the house as the leader the others simply followed. It's the kind of statement that drew its own wave of criticism online, and legally it doesn't move the needle either way. But in a case getting this much public attention, that kind of commentary shapes the narrative around it, whether it's meant to or not. Now to Elizabeth Siders herself, the mother of all 16 children. Her attorney, Tommy Staley, has filed a motion asking the court to modify her $300,000 bond, arguing she's a 33-year-old woman with no known criminal history, no prior record of failing to appear in court, and that she's cooperated fully with the investigation since it began. If released, he says she'll wear a GPS monitor, check in with a bond officer as frequently as the court wants, and provide a stable address within the county or a neighboring one. He also argues there's no remaining risk to anyone because the children who would have been the alleged victims have already been removed from the home by the state, so the danger the bond amount was presumably meant to guard against isn't really present anymore. And he notes, without elaborating much further, that Elizabeth simply doesn't have the financial means to post any amount of cash bail, tying that directly back to the extreme poverty prosecutors say defined the household in the first place. According to her attorney, Elizabeth's overriding concern since her arrest has been reuniting with her children. He noted in his filing that she understands reunification of any sort is an impossibility if she doesn't show up to court, which in the motion's framing is itself the strongest argument that she's not a flight risk. She has nowhere to go and nothing to gain by disappearing. What the motion doesn't dwell on is something worth remembering here. Elizabeth was 15 years old when she married into this family, and he was 18. That marriage happened back in 2008 in West Virginia. Court records show her parents and a judge gave consent. Marriage records show he'd completed 9th grade and she'd completed 8th, and there's no indication either went further after that. Their first child arrived just 2 months after the wedding, meaning Elizabeth was already pregnant at 15 when the marriage took place. More children followed steadily over the years, roughly 1 a year for most of the next 18 years, including 2 sets of twins among the 16 who survived. And the count of 16 surviving children isn't the complete number. State records show that in November 2022, Elizabeth gave birth to another set of twins, girls named Bailey Lee Siders and Faith Lee Siders. They were conjoined, born extremely premature at an estimated 24 weeks. Both died the same day at Riverside Methodist Hospital. Counting them, Elizabeth is believed to have given birth 18 times since she was a teenager. From the age of 15 to 33, she was pregnant or raising a newborn for the overwhelming majority of those years, with no public record of having worked outside the home, attended school beyond the 8th grade, or lived independently of the Siders family at any point since her marriage. Officials have said that loss isn't currently connected to the endangering charges, but investigators have acknowledged it adds another layer to the family's history they're continuing to examine. Her own attorney was asked point-blank whether he considers her a victim in all of this, and he didn't give a clean answer. His office isn't sure. He said she hasn't shown what would typically be described as victim behavior, but the investigation is still ongoing. It's an unusually candid thing for a defense attorney to say publicly, and it tells you that even the person representing her hasn't settled on how to frame her role in this. As of now, prosecutors haven't formally responded to her bond motion, so whether the state opposes her release is still an open question. If you're still with me, you're clearly someone who cares about justice and the stories of those who are failed by the system. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a case like this one. Every subscriber helps us keep these stories alive. This case has also drawn some pointed comparisons to one of the most notorious child abuse cases in recent American history, the Turpin family of Riverside County, California, where in 2018, 13 children were found shackled, starved, and confined inside their parents' home. Some so malnourished, a 14-year-old weighed the same as a 3-year-old. David and Louise Turpin are now serving life sentences after pleading guilty to torture and false imprisonment, among other charges. A retired detective who led the original Turpin rescue, Thomas Salisbury, has since weighed in on the Ohio case, and what he sees worries him. The parallels, the widespread of children's ages, the total absence of schooling or medical records, the confinement, the physical deterioration, are close enough that he says the case immediately brought back a flood of memories. He described walking into the station after the Turpin children were rescued and seeing some of them standing in a courtyard with their arms raised toward the sun as though they'd rarely been allowed outside. Their clothing was caked with filth. Their bodies were so emaciated they looked, in his words, like internment camp photographs from World War II. But he's also flagged one crucial difference that may make the Ohio case harder going forward. In the Turpin household, the older siblings had managed to build something resembling an internal support system. They'd passed along rudimentary lessons to the younger children, informal schooling, shared coping strategies, a network of mutual protection that despite everything gave most of them the ability to speak, to read at some level, and to eventually recover with professional help. In Ohio, investigators say several of the children can't speak at all, and the oldest among them can't write her own name. Details that, if accurate, suggest a level of developmental deprivation that may run even deeper than what Salisbury encountered with the Turpins, where the older children had at least managed some self-directed education among themselves. Salisbury used the word heartbreaking. The Attorney General used the word feral. Both descriptions coming from opposite sides of the country are pointing at the same thing. On the question of charges, legal observers and investigators who've worked cases like this have noted that child endangering may not be where this ends. Each of the 4 defendants currently faces 16 counts, each a second-degree felony carrying 2 to 12 years. But in the Turpin case, prosecutors didn't stop there. Once detailed medical documentation supported it, they pursued torture and false imprisonment charges, the kind of charges that carry life sentences and that ultimately resulted in David and Louise Turpin dying in prison. Whether Ohio prosecutors follow a similar path here depends on what the medical evidence ultimately shows across all 16 children spread over several hospitals and trauma centers. But the fact that 2 children had to be airlifted, and one was in critical condition discovered that way, not reported, has already raised the question of whether the current charges fully capture what happened inside that house. You don't necessarily need chains or cages to meet the legal threshold for false imprisonment or torture. Fear, confinement, and sustained deprivation can get you there too. Salisbury himself has said he believes there are potential kidnapping for torture charges just in the medical condition of the most seriously injured children, even without the physical restraints that were present in the Turpin home. There's also a practical reason prosecutors in cases like this tend to start with the charge they can prove fastest and build from there. Endangering children doesn't require establishing intent to cause specific harm, only that a caregiver's actions or inactions created a substantial risk to a child's health or safety. Torture and false imprisonment require a higher bar, proof of a sustained deliberate pattern of confinement or cruelty, usually supported by the kind of detailed medical documentation that takes weeks or months to compile across 16 separate cases. The initial charges may simply reflect what investigators could establish in the earliest days. More serious counts could follow once the full picture comes together, and investigators have said publicly that additional charges remain a possibility. The last major update involves who's actually running this prosecution. Vinton County is small enough that the prosecutor's office doesn't have the resources to handle a case of this size on its own. 2 special prosecutors have now been brought in to assist. An assistant attorney general with extensive experience in child cases and a prosecutor from neighboring Highland County, who the local prosecutor William Archer describes as a former colleague. Both are being provided at no cost to local taxpayers. And to be clear, this isn't happening because of any conflict of interest with the current prosecutor's office. The case is staying with Vinton County. This is simply outside help for a case that's outgrown what one small rural office can manage alone. The Attorney General's office has said that nearly half of Ohio's 88 counties have requested similar support from their Special Prosecution Section in the past year, framing the assistance as routine rather than extraordinary. As for what happens next on the legal side, the case still has to go before a grand jury, and that could take a while. Vinton County only convenes a grand jury about every other month, which is part of why the preliminary hearing process became relevant in the first place. All 4 family members waived their rights to preliminary hearings, meaning the public won't get an early detailed airing of the state's evidence that will wait for indictment or trial, whichever comes first. The investigation is ongoing, and there's still a lot we don't know, including whether Gary Jr. and Elizabeth were ever receiving welfare benefits themselves, how many times over the years this family may have crossed paths with Children's Services without anyone catching what was happening, and whether Gary Siders Sr. will ever be found competent enough to face trial at all. And then there's the question that sits underneath all of this, the one that has nothing to do with bond motions or competency hearings or grand jury schedules. What happens to 16 kids whose lives may have been stolen from them long before investigators ever went through that door? Officials say the children are currently in the custody of the state and have been placed in safe environments with multidisciplinary teams coordinating medical care and behavioral health services. But safe is a word that carries weight only if someone's watching closely enough to make sure it stays true. The Turpin case proved that rescue isn't the same as recovery, and that the system built to protect children after the worst has happened can fail them all over again if nobody's paying attention. Salisbury's advice has been specific and direct. Put these kids in one place. Bring the professionals to them. Don't scatter them individually across the foster system where oversight can quietly slip. That advice isn't theoretical. It's built on watching it go wrong the first time, on seeing the children he'd rescued from one nightmare land in another one. There's also the question of the 18-year-old legally an adult, functionally anything but. A young woman who, according to investigators, cannot write her own name, who has spent most of her remembered life inside a house that was by every official description closer to a holding cell than a home. What services exist for her now? What happens when she ages out of whatever custody arrangement currently protects her? Nobody has addressed that publicly yet, and it may be the single most urgent question in this entire case that has nothing to do with the courtroom. Whether Ohio gets this part right, whether these 16 children get the kind of sustained, specialized, coordinated care that gives them an actual chance at something resembling a normal life, may end up mattering more than anything that happens at trial. The Turpin children, Salisbury has noted, are largely thriving today, years after the worst of it. It took time, specialized professionals, and relentless oversight to get them there. Whether anyone provides the same for the 16 children rescued from Omar Street is right now still an open question. We're going to keep a close eye on this one as it develops. If there's anything more you want looked into, let us know, and we'll be back with the next update as soon as there's more to report. Thank you so much for joining us, and as always, please subscribe so you don't miss the next update on this case. See you next time, everybody.